In the summer of 1957, deep in the Virginia soil beneath the altar of a freshly renovated church, a workman's shovel struck iron. What he unearthed was a small, rusted lockbox, sealed shut by a century of heat and silence. It held the truth of a story the church had buried with desperate finality, the macabre mystery of the pastor's daughter who fell in love with a slave, a forbidden affair from 1846 that ended in fire and blood. Inside lay a scorched diary, a tarnished silver ring, and a portrait of a man whose name had been erased from every official record. This is not just the story of a hidden crime, but of how an institution built on faith became complicit in murder to protect its own purity. The official history of Amherst, Virginia, records a tragic fire and the gentle decline of a troubled young woman. But the contents of the box ask a darker question, one that echoes from the unmarked graves of the past. How did a secret pact of love, sealed in the shadow of the cross, provoke a holy man to commit an unforgivable sin? And what terrifying truth about faith and power in America was so dangerous that it had to be completely erased from history? The stories we bury define us more than the ones we celebrate. If you believe that the darkest corners of our past hold the most important lessons, then we invite you to subscribe to Before the Story and enable notifications so you never miss an investigation. If this is the kind of deep historical truth you value, please take a moment to like this video. And now let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The narrative of this Virginia tragedy begins not in 1846, but with the scent of damp earth and rusted metal in 1957. The discovery of the lockbox beneath the charred floorboards of St. Matthew's Hollow Church was an accident of progress, a ghost unearthed by renovation. Its contents served as a key, unlocking a past that had been meticulously sealed away. The first legible page of the scorched diary, written in the disciplined script of 19-year-old Evelyn Dorsey, immediately establishes the suffocating atmosphere of her world. Dated April 2, 1846, her words paint a portrait of piety laced with a deep, unspoken dread, a chilling introduction to the religious order that governed every aspect of life in Amherst. Evelyn was the only daughter of Reverend Nathaniel Dorsey, a man whose reputation in Amherst was built on a foundation of unyielding moral certainty. His sermons, delivered from the high pulpit of St. Matthew's, were famous throughout the county for their fire and brimstone condemnations of sin and their rigid defense of the God-given social hierarchy. The church was the absolute center of the community's universe, its wooden spire a constant reminder of the divine judgment that watched over the town. Within this world, the lines between master and slave, saved and damned, were drawn with the certainty of Holy Scripture itself, a truth no one dared to question. The parish house where Evelyn lived under her father's austere gaze was a place of quiet devotion and unspoken rules. It was also home to Jonas, an enslaved man in his early 20s, and his mother, Martha. Reverend Dorsey often spoke of having rescued them from the darkness of an unchristian life, a narrative of benevolent salvation that solidified his standing in the community. Yet, persistent whispers among the older townsfolk suggested a different story, one of a forced baptism and a family handed to the church not as congregants, but as property. Jonas was assigned the task of maintaining the church, a silent, almost invisible figure in a sacred space. His presence, like that of his mother, was a testament to the paradox of the antebellum South, where the men who preached of spiritual freedom were often the same men who held the keys to physical bondage. The church, a place of sanctuary and grace, simultaneously functioned as an instrument of control, its Bibles used to justify the chains that bound one part of its community. This inherent contradiction was the air Evelyn breathed, a moral ambiguity that she was taught to accept as part of God's inscrutable plan. The world was as her father described it, orderly, righteous, and severe. Inside the lockbox, beside the diary, lay the other artifacts that would later challenge this official version of reality. A small silver ring, intricately carved with ivy leaves, was later identified as having belonged to Evelyn's deceased mother, a precious heirloom not to be parted with lightly. There was also a small folded piece of linen onto which a charcoal portrait of a young black man had been carefully sketched. His expression was not one of submission, but of a quiet, profound intelligence. These objects, intimate and personal, were the first pieces of evidence that a far more human story existed beneath the town's cold, pious surface. The initial diary entry speaks of this coldness with an almost prophetic clarity. "Father preached today on the purity of the soul and the darkness that awaits the disobedient," Evelyn wrote. "From the pulpit, his eyes found mine, and I felt the chill of God's perfect order. It is a righteous order, I know. Yet I wonder if righteousness must always feel so cold." This single, questioning sentence, penned in secret, represents the first crack in the foundation of her world, a flicker of doubt in the face of absolute certainty. It was this doubt that would set her on a collision course with her father, her faith, and her entire society. The Amherst of 1846 was a place where secrets were kept through a shared, unspoken agreement. The community's survival depended on the maintenance of its rigid structure, and any deviation was seen not just as a social transgression, but as a spiritual threat. The story of Evelyn and Jonas was therefore not merely a personal tragedy. It was a fundamental challenge to the town's very identity. The desperate measures taken to erase it from the historical record speak to the existential danger it represented. The truth, once buried, waited patiently for over a century to be told. The lockbox itself, a primitive time capsule, seemed to understand its purpose. Forged of heavy iron, it had survived a fire, resisted the decay of the damp earth, and protected its fragile contents from the ravages of time. It was a vessel of memory, a silent witness waiting to deliver its testimony. When it was finally opened in the bright sunlight of 1957, it released not just the story of two forbidden lovers, but the buried conscience of an entire town, forcing a new generation to confront the sins of its fathers and the true cost of their salvation. Before the discovery of these artifacts, the official history of the Dorsey family was simple and tragic. It spoke of a pious daughter, prone to melancholy, who had succumbed to a fragile mental state after her mother's passing. The fire at the church was recorded as an unfortunate accident linked to her instability, but the objects in the box told a different story, one of intention, love, and a calculated act of defiance. They were the last will and testament of a young woman who, having been silenced in life, had taken meticulous care to ensure her truth would one day speak from beyond the grave. The first documented anomaly in the perfectly ordered world of Evelyn Dorsey was not a supernatural event, but an act of quiet, human connection that defied the rigid social code of Amherst. In the spring of 1846, Evelyn developed a habit of remaining in the church long after the Sunday service had concluded. The vast, empty nave offered a rare moment of solitude, a space where she could retreat into the melancholic melodies of the church piano without the weight of her father's judgment. It was in this silence that her world first began to shift, subtly and irrevocably, in the presence of the church's silent keeper. Jonas was a constant, unobtrusive feature of the sanctuary, his duties requiring him to tune the piano, polish the pews, and ensure the altar was always prepared for worship. He moved through the space with a practiced invisibility, his presence acknowledged by no one, his thoughts his own. For weeks, their shared occupation of the church was one of distant, silent coexistence. She played, he worked, and the gulf of race and station that separated them remained as vast and impassable as the church aisle itself. He was property, and she was the keeper's daughter. No other reality was permitted. The breach occurred on a late April afternoon as sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting patterns of color on the wooden floor. Evelyn, lost in a particularly complex hymn, stumbled over a difficult passage, her fingers fumbling on the keys. A frustrated silence fell over the church. Then, from the shadows behind the towering organ pipes, a low, certain voice hummed the correct note, a perfect, sorrowful melody that hung in the air for a moment before fading. The sound was so unexpected, so contrary to the established order, that it seemed to momentarily stop time itself. Evelyn's diary entry from that evening captures the profound impact of this small event. "I was startled, for we are taught they are without art," she wrote, her words betraying the deep-seated prejudices she had been raised to accept as truth. But his voice held a sorrow more profound than any hymn. In that single, unbidden note, Jonas had revealed a depth of feeling, a soulfulness that her father's theology had never accounted for. He had ceased to be an object or a functionary and had become, in her eyes, a person possessed of an interior world as complex as her own. This moment of shared music became the catalyst for a more dangerous discovery. A week later, Evelyn found Jonas near her hymnal, his finger tracing the printed letters of the alphabet as if trying to decipher a foreign code. It was then she understood that his supposed illiteracy, a condition assumed of nearly all enslaved people, was a carefully constructed performance. He could read. He possessed a key to the world of words and ideas, a key he had been forced to hide his entire life for his own safety. The knowledge was a secret that now belonged to both of them. Her decision to teach him in secret, using the New Testament as a cover, was the first truly defiant act of her young life. It was an act of compassion, but it was also a rebellion against the very foundations of her father's power. In the slave-holding South, an educated black man was considered a threat, a dangerous anomaly that could disrupt the entire system of control. To willingly impart such knowledge was to subvert the natural order, an act of treason against her race and her class. But for Evelyn, it felt less like a transgression and more like a moral imperative. The church, once a symbol of her father's authority, began to transform. It became their clandestine classroom, a sanctuary in a truer sense of the word. The towering crucifix that watched over them seemed to sanction their secret meetings, its silent presence a witness to an act of fellowship that was both profoundly Christian and deeply heretical in the context of their world. The space was no longer defined solely by her father's sermons, but by the quiet whispers of their shared lessons, the rustle of turning pages, and the shared understanding that they were treading on forbidden ground. The anomaly was not just that Jonas could read, but that his understanding of the scriptures was so deeply intuitive. Evelyn's diary notes her growing astonishment at his insights. He saw not just rules and damnation in the Holy Book, but a persistent, underlying message of justice and liberation that had been entirely absent from her religious education. He was not just a student, he was a theologian in his own right, one whose perspective had been shaped by a lived experience of suffering that made the biblical stories of bondage and redemption intensely personal. This intellectual awakening was the most profound anomaly of all. In teaching Jonas, Evelyn began to unlearn the certainties that had defined her existence. She started to see the world not through her father's eyes, but through the lens of a shared, forbidden knowledge. The silence between them had been broken, first by a single note of music and then by the power of the written word. This initial deviation from the norm had set them on a path from which there would be no return, a journey into a shared emotional and intellectual landscape that would ultimately cost them everything. The secret lessons in the empty church began to accumulate, each meeting a piece of evidence in a growing case against the world Evelyn had once known. What had started as a simple act of instruction quickly evolved into a complex exchange of ideas, a dialogue that systematically dismantled the theological walls her father had built around her. Her diary from this period becomes a logbook of her intellectual and spiritual transformation, each entry documenting a new revelation, a new piece of anomalous knowledge that did not fit within the rigid framework of her upbringing. She arrived at their meetings with the New Testament, prepared to teach the Gospels of love and forgiveness. But Jonas, it turned out, already knew those stories intimately. He would listen patiently, his gaze fixed on the text, and then he would ask questions that left her unsettled. He would gently guide her to the Old Testament, to the books her father rarely, if ever, preached from. He would point to the fiery words of the prophet Isaiah, who spoke of a God who demanded that his followers loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke. An entry from June 1846 reveals the growing power of this alternative curriculum. He asked if I had read the words of Exodus for the man-stealer, Evelyn wrote, a reference to a law prescribing death for those who kidnap and sell a person into slavery. Father never preaches from those books. Jonas says some truths are too heavy for a comfortable pulpit. He speaks of God not as a master, but as a liberator. This feels like a dangerous thought. The thought was indeed dangerous, for it reframed the entire institution of slavery not as a worldly necessity, but as a direct violation of God's own law. Their nightly meetings became a ritual of intellectual discovery. The church crypt, a cool subterranean space beneath the main chapel, became their preferred classroom, its stone walls providing a sense of security and isolation. Down there, surrounded by the tombs of Amherst's founding families, they were hidden from the prying eyes of the world. The symbolism was not lost on Evelyn. They were literally and figuratively excavating a buried truth, uncovering a version of their faith that had been interred beneath layers of tradition and self-interest. The parish's financial ledgers from this time contain a curious entry: the purchase of a new, heavy iron lock for the crypt door, an expense for which no official reason was ever provided. The accumulation of evidence was not just theological, it was deeply personal. In the safety of the crypt, Jonas began to share fragments of his own story and that of his mother, Martha. He spoke of a life before their rescue by the Reverend, a life in a different county where his family had been free. He described the violent, disorienting experience of being forcibly baptized, an act presented as salvation, but which felt like a spiritual branding, a ceremony that marked them as property of the church. This personal testimony was the most powerful evidence of all, transforming the abstract sin of slavery into a tangible, human tragedy. Evelyn, in turn, began to confess her own feelings of spiritual imprisonment. She spoke of her loneliness, of the suffocating weight of her father's expectations, and of her growing disillusionment with the cold, unforgiving version of Christianity she had been taught. The crypt became a confessional for them both, a space where two souls, trapped at opposite ends of a brutal social hierarchy, could meet as equals. Their relationship was no longer that of teacher and student, but of two confidants sharing a dangerous and liberating truth. The anomalous evidence was also physical. Evelyn's diary notes that Jonas had begun to repair the broken stained glass window at the back of the church, a task no one had assigned him. He worked on it secretly, piece by piece, using fragments of colored glass he had found discarded. When she asked him why, he simply said that even a broken house deserves to have light. His quiet acts of care for the church stood in stark contrast to her father's use of it as a place of judgment and commerce. Jonas treated the building as a sacred space, even as it was the instrument of his own bondage. As the summer wore on, the weight of their shared secrets grew. Evelyn became more withdrawn during the day, her interactions with her father strained by the knowledge she now possessed. Her diary entries became more introspective, filled with a growing sense of foreboding. She knew that their secret world could not last, that the truths they were uncovering were too explosive to remain hidden forever. The evidence was accumulating not just in her journal, but in the subtle changes in her own demeanor, changes that would not go unnoticed for much longer. The final piece of anomalous evidence from this period was a change in Evelyn's piano playing. Parishioners began to remark that the sorrowful hymns she once favored were now being played with a strange new undertone of defiance, almost of hope. The music that filled the church on those Sunday afternoons was no longer just the sound of a lonely girl's private grief. It was the soundtrack to a quiet rebellion, a secret revolution of two souls taking place in the heart of an institution that would have condemned them both to damnation had it known the truth. By the early autumn of 1846, the accumulation of secret knowledge and shared confessions forced Evelyn Dorsey to formulate a new and devastating hypothesis about the nature of her world. The insulated reality, constructed by her father's sermons and the town's silent complicity, began to crumble, replaced by a stark and terrifying understanding of the truth. This intellectual breakthrough, documented in the later pages of her diary, was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, painful connecting of dots that led to an inescapable conclusion about the deep, systemic corruption at the heart of her father's ministry. The catalyst for this realization was a practical matter of church finance. The parish had fallen into debt, and Reverend Dorsey announced his intention to raise a new, grander steeple for the church, a project he claimed would glorify God and stand as a testament to the town's piety. To fund this ambition, he made a decision that, to the rest of the community, seemed like a sound and unremarkable business transaction. He decided to sell Jonas to a plantation owner in the Deep South, a move that would both settle the church's debts and finance the new construction. For Evelyn, this news was a cataclysm. It was the moment the abstract theological hypocrisy they had discussed in the crypt became a concrete and imminent act of cruelty. Her father, the man who preached of saving souls, was preparing to sell a human being to fund the adornment of a building. The transaction exposed the rotten core of his faith, revealing that in his moral calculus, a man's life was worth less than a steeple of wood and stone. This act of spiritual bankruptcy was the final piece of evidence she needed. A diary entry from September 9th, written in a script that trembles with rage and disillusionment, records the moment her hypothesis crystallized. Father speaks of salvation, yet he plans to sell Jonas south to pay for the new steeple. He uses God's house to conduct the trade of men. I see it now. This is not a house of faith. It is a marketplace with a cross. The sin is not in Jonas's bonds, but in the holy words used to forge them. This passage is the turning point of her entire narrative, the moment she ceases to be a passive observer and becomes a conscious and articulate critic of her father's world. Her hypothesis was simple but profound. The church, as an institution, was not just complicit in the sin of slavery. It was an active participant, using the language of salvation to mask its own greed and its lust for power. Her father was not a misguided man of God. He was a merchant whose primary commodity was human souls, both the ones he claimed to save and the ones he was willing to sell. The entire religious structure of Amherst was, in her new understanding, a carefully constructed lie, a performance of piety designed to uphold a brutal and unholy system. This new understanding recontextualized everything she had experienced. Her father's coldness was not righteousness. It was the emotional detachment of a man who saw people as assets. The town's quiet obedience was not faith. It was the calculated silence of people who benefited from the system. Even her own privileged position as the pastor's daughter was not a blessing, but a form of gilded captivity. Her life a testament to the gilded hypocrisy of her family. She was as much a part of the performance as anyone else. The discovery of this truth was a profoundly isolating experience. There was no one in her world with whom she could share this hypothesis. To speak it aloud would be to invite condemnation, to be labeled as mad, or worse, as a heretic. The truth she now possessed was a burden she had to carry alone, a secret that separated her from her community as surely as if she had been excommunicated. Her only ally was Jonas, the very person whose impending fate had forced her to see the world with such brutal clarity. With this new hypothesis, Evelyn's motivations shifted. Her secret meetings with Jonas were no longer just about intellectual curiosity or emotional connection. They became acts of resistance. She was no longer simply trying to comfort a friend. She was actively working against an institution she now understood to be fundamentally corrupt. Her diary entries from this period take on a new tone of urgency as she begins to contemplate what she, a powerless young woman, could possibly do to intervene in the face of such an unassailable system. The formulation of this hypothesis was the true beginning of her rebellion. It armed her with a moral certainty that was, in its own way, as absolute as her father's. She now had a name for the coldness she had felt her entire life. It was the chill of a faith that had been emptied of all its grace, a hollow shell of ritual and rhetoric that served not God, but the interests of powerful men. This understanding would guide her actions in the tragic weeks to come, transforming her from a dutiful daughter into a righteous adversary. The social fracture began the moment Evelyn Dorsey decided to move her dissent from the private pages of her diary into the public, sanctified space of the parish house. Armed with her new, terrible understanding of her father's hypocrisy, she chose to confront him directly, pleading with him to spare Jonas from being sold. This act of open defiance, a daughter challenging the absolute authority of her father and pastor, sent a shockwave through the carefully ordered world of the Dorsey household and, by extension, the entire community of Amherst. While Evelyn's own journal remains conspicuously silent on the details of this confrontation, the event was significant enough to be recorded elsewhere. A letter dated October 17, 1846, written by a prominent parishioner named Elizabeth Gable to her sister in Richmond, provides a chilling third-party account of the incident and its immediate aftermath. The letter, preserved in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society, serves as a crucial piece of evidence, documenting the moment the private conflict became a public scandal. Mrs. Gable's tone is one of shocked disapproval. Her words a perfect reflection of the community's values. "A most unsettling scene at the parish house," she wrote, her elegant script detailing the events with a mixture of gossip and genuine alarm. The Reverend's daughter, Evelyn, has developed an unseemly attachment to the church Negro, Jonas. She was heard begging her father on his behalf, with a passion ill-suited for a young woman of her station. The letter reveals how quickly Evelyn's act of moral courage was reinterpreted by the community through the lens of social and racial transgression. Her plea for justice was seen as an emotional, hysterical outburst, a violation of the strict codes of feminine decorum. The Reverend's reaction, as documented by Mrs. Gable, was swift and severe. The Reverend was forced to discipline her for her outburst. The letter continues, the passive language absolving Reverend Dorsey of all agency and framing his actions as a regrettable necessity. There are whispers her mind has grown fragile. In a single stroke, Evelyn's righteous anger was pathologized, dismissed as the product of a weak and unstable female mind. This diagnosis of madness was the community's primary defense mechanism, a way to neutralize her dissent without having to engage with the substance of her critique. The immediate consequence of this social fracture was Evelyn's effective imprisonment. She was confined to her room in the parish house, her movements restricted, her access to the outside world cut off. This physical isolation was a punishment, but it was also a strategic move by her father to contain the scandal. By locking her away, he could control the narrative, reinforcing the idea that she was unwell and therefore unreliable. Her confinement was a visible symbol of the community's intolerance for dissent. Any voice that challenged the established order would be silenced, one way or another. This period of forced isolation only solidified Evelyn's resolve. Separated from Jonas, and with the date of his sale looming, her sense of urgency intensified. The walls of her room, which had once represented safety and comfort, now felt like the bars of a cell. Her diary entries from this time are filled with a sense of desperate frustration, but also with a growing clarity of purpose. The community's rejection of her plea had proven her hypothesis correct. Their faith was a sham, their morality a tool of oppression. The social fracture also had a profound impact on the enslaved community at the parish house. While no direct records exist of their reactions, the sudden and violent shift in the household's atmosphere must have been palpable. Jonas's mother, Martha, would have witnessed the confrontation and its aftermath, her own silent suffering compounded by the knowledge of her son's impending sale and the punishment visited upon the one person who had dared to speak for him. The silence of the enslaved characters in the historical record is a testament to their powerlessness, a reminder that their perspectives were deemed unworthy of preservation. The community's response reveals the deep-seated fear that underpinned their rigid social structure. Evelyn's crime was not just that she had spoken out of turn, but that she had demonstrated empathy across the racial divide. To see an enslaved person as a fellow human being worthy of compassion was to threaten the entire ideological justification for slavery. Her unseemly attachment was a crack in the dam of racial hierarchy, and the community rushed to seal it before it could widen into a flood. The letter from Elizabeth Gable is therefore more than just a piece of society gossip. It is a primary source document that records the mechanics of social control in the antebellum South. It shows how dissent was managed, how women's voices were discredited, and how the narrative of mental instability was deployed to protect the status quo. The social fracture was not just a conflict between a father and a daughter, It was a clash between two irreconcilable moral universes, and the dominant one had just begun to bring its full weight to bear on the one that dared to challenge it. On the night of October 28, 1846, with the full moon casting a spectral glow over the quiet town of Amherst, Evelyn Dorsey committed her final irrevocable act of rebellion. She escaped from her confinement in the parish house, a desperate flight into the darkness to meet Jonas one last time before he was to be taken away. This clandestine meeting, held in the cold, silent church crypt, would become the emotional and moral centerpiece of the entire tragedy. The vow they made and the object that sealed it would later serve as irrefutable evidence of a bond that the official history tried to deny. The only record of this night comes from a single, frantic entry in Evelyn's diary, written in a tear-stained, almost illegible script, likely upon her return to her room. The passage is a raw and powerful testament to the depth of their connection, a final declaration of love and loyalty in the face of certain separation. It describes a pact made not before a preacher or a congregation, but in the subterranean darkness, witnessed only by the stone-cold tombs of the town's ancestors. It was a ceremony of their own devising, a sacred rite that existed outside the sanction of any earthly authority. "If we cannot share the light, we will be united in this darkness," Evelyn wrote, quoting the vow they had made to each other. "I gave him mother's ring." He said that in God's eyes, a vow made is a vow kept, whether above ground or below it. He touched my face, and for the first time, I did not feel the chill of righteousness, but the warmth of grace. This passage is the heart of the story. The moment a forbidden affair was transformed into a spiritual union, a marriage of souls conducted in the shadow of death. The silver ring, the ivy-carved heirloom passed down from her mother, was the physical manifestation of this vow. In a society where the law explicitly forbade any form of legal or religious union between black and white individuals, this exchange of a ring was a radical act of self-determination. It was a private declaration that their bond was more legitimate, more sacred in the eyes of a true God than any law or custom that denied their humanity. The ring, discovered in the lockbox over a century later, stands as a silent metallic witness, its presence corroborating the truth of Evelyn's words. This act had a profound and immediate impact on Evelyn's psychological state. The diary entry, though sorrowful, is not one of despair. Instead, it is imbued with a sense of transcendent purpose. By making this vow and sealing it with the most precious object she owned, she had found a way to defy her fate. They might be physically separated, but their spiritual union was now eternal. This belief gave her a strength and a clarity that would carry her through the horrors of the following day. She had made a choice, and she would not waver from it. The act of recovering the ring after Jonas's death, a detail she would later record, speaks to her incredible presence of mind, even in the depths of grief. She understood its significance not just as a personal memento, but as a piece of evidence. It was proof of their pact, a tangible link to the man whose very existence her father was trying to erase. The ring was not just a symbol of love. It was an artifact of resistance, a piece of the historical record she was determined to preserve against the official narrative. The irrefutable evidence of the ring and the diary entry fundamentally alters our understanding of Evelyn's subsequent actions. Her final fiery act of defiance was not, as the official record would claim, the product of a mind unhinged by grief. It was the calculated act of a woman who considered herself a widow, a woman whose sacred vow had been violated by an act of brutal, state-sanctioned murder. She was not simply mourning a lost love, She was seeking justice for a desecrated sacrament. The impact of this evidence, when it finally came to light in 1957, was explosive. It forced a complete re-evaluation of the town's history, transforming a forgotten local tragedy into a powerful story of love and resistance. It proved that behind the cold official documents and the sanitized community memory, there had been a vibrant, courageous, and deeply human relationship. The ring and the diary were not just objects, they were the voices of the silenced, speaking their truth after a century of enforced silence. Ultimately, the vow in the crypt was the point of no return. It was a conscious and deliberate choice to step outside the bounds of their society, to create their own moral law based on love and mutual respect. This irrefutable evidence shows that Evelyn and Jonas were not simply victims of a cruel system. They were active agents in their own story, who for one brief shining moment in the darkness of a tomb forged a union that was more powerful and more enduring than the institution that sought to destroy them. The morning of October 29, 1846, marked the complete and brutal collapse of any remaining moral authority held by Reverend Nathaniel Dorsey and the church he represented. The discovery of Evelyn's empty room and Jonas's absence from his quarters triggered a response not of concern, but of punitive fury. The system of control, which had been subtly challenged by Evelyn's dissent, now reasserted itself with overt and terrifying violence. The events of this day, recorded with chilling detachment in the official church ledger, exposed the raw, coercive power that lay beneath the veneer of Christian piety. Jonas was not treated as a man who had been meeting a loved one, but as a fugitive slave, a piece of property that had attempted to abscond. He was quickly captured by the county slave patrol, a deputized militia whose sole purpose was to hunt down and return escaped slaves. His capture was not just a legal matter. It was a public spectacle designed to reinforce the absolute power of the master class. He was not returned to his quarters, but dragged directly to the grounds of St. Matthew's Hollow Church, the very place that had been the site of his secret education and his sacred vow. The official record of what happened next, inscribed in the church's own ledger in the precise, emotionless handwriting of Reverend Dorsey himself, is perhaps the most damning document in the entire case. It is a masterpiece of bureaucratic euphemism, language designed to obscure an act of horrific violence by framing it as a necessary and righteous procedure. The entry reads, October 29, 1846. The fugitive Jonas, having absconded, was returned by the county patrol. As a deterrent against further rebellion and to purify this house of his defiant spirit, necessary discipline was administered before the congregation. The phrase necessary discipline was a commonly understood code in the antebellum South for a brutal public whipping, often intended to be fatal. This was not a private punishment, it was a public ritual of terror. The congregation was not dismissed, they were made to watch. This was a sermon delivered not with words, but with a lash, a lesson in the consequences of defiance intended for every enslaved person in Amherst. The church, a house of worship, was transformed into an arena of state-sanctioned torture, its cross casting a long shadow over the proceedings. The record concludes with a single devastating line. The subject did not survive the correction. Beat in these 6 words, a human life is extinguished, a murder is documented, and the perpetrator absolves himself of all guilt. Jonas is not a man who was killed, he is a subject who did not survive. The language is that of a failed medical procedure, not a homicide. This clinical detachment is the ultimate expression of the Reverend's collapsed authority. He had abandoned any pretense of moral leadership and had become a mere functionary of a brutal system, his ledger a record of its crimes. Locked in her room, Evelyn witnessed the entire ordeal from her second-story window. Her diary from this day is a fractured, almost incoherent record of the horror, a stream of consciousness account of watching the man she loved be destroyed before her eyes. "They whipped him at the foot of the cross," she wrote, the words scrawled across the page. "His blood is on the stones." Itil. This first-hand testimony, when placed alongside the Reverend's cold, official record, creates an unbearable tension between the lived experience of trauma and the sanitized language of oppression. The apathetic cruelty of the official record reveals the true nature of the authority that governed Amherst. It was not based on divine grace or moral suasion, but on the ever-present threat of violence. The church was not a place of refuge. It was the primary instrument of social control, its sacred symbols co-opted to sanctify acts of unimaginable cruelty. Reverend Dorsey's decision to carry out the punishment on church grounds was a deliberate act of symbolic power, a declaration that his authority and God's authority were one and the same. This event marks the final, irreversible collapse. The Reverend had not just killed a man, he had desecrated his own church, staining its grounds with the blood of an innocent. He had used a ritual of purification to commit a profound act of spiritual pollution. In his attempt to reassert his absolute authority, he had revealed himself to be utterly devoid of it. He was no longer a pastor. He was a tyrant, his pulpit a throne built on fear, and his cross a symbol of terror. The congregation's silent complicity in this act is a crucial part of the story. By watching without protest, they became participants in the crime. Their silence was a form of consent, an acknowledgement that this public display of brutality was a necessary component of the world they had built. The collapse of authority was not just the Reverend's personal moral failure, it was a collective one, a sin in which the entire community was implicated. The blood on the stones was a stain on all their souls. In the immediate aftermath of Jonas's murder, while trapped in the suffocating silence of her room, Evelyn Dorsey began a new and final project. Overwhelmed by a grief so profound it threatened to consume her, she channeled her anguish into a single, focused act of creation. She began to assemble the contents of the lockbox. This was not a sentimental gathering of keepsakes. It was the conscious and deliberate creation of a hidden source, an archive of counter-evidence designed to one day challenge and overturn the official narrative of lies her father was already constructing. Her diary entry from this period, though fragmented, reveals her methodical approach. She understood that Jonas's body would be disposed of in an unmarked grave, his name stricken from any record, his life erased as if it had never been. She knew that her own testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. If their story was to survive, it needed a physical vessel, a collection of tangible objects that could not be easily explained away. The lockbox was to be this vessel, a tomb for their story that was meant to be discovered. First, she secured the charcoal portrait she had sketched of Jonas from memory. This was a crucial act of preservation. In a world where enslaved people were rarely, if ever, afforded the dignity of a formal portrait, this simple, hand-drawn image was a radical statement of his individuality and his humanity. It was a face to go with the erased name, a visual record of the man they were trying to turn into a non-person. The act of drawing him was an act of remembrance, but the act of preserving the drawing was an act of historical defiance. Next, and most perilously, she recovered the silver ring. Her diary hints at how this was accomplished, suggesting she enlisted the help of Jonas's grieving mother, Martha, who would have been tasked with preparing his body for its unceremonious burial. The ring, having been on his hand when he died, was now a sacred relic, an object that had borne witness to both their vow of love and his final moments of agony. By retrieving it, Evelyn was reclaiming the central symbol of their union from the scene of the crime, ensuring it would not be lost or stolen. She then composed the final piece of her archive, the small embroidered square of white linen. The fabric, likely torn from a petticoat or a nightdress, was a deeply personal choice, a piece of herself she was adding to the collection. Onto this fabric, she stitched her own initials, E.D., intertwined with a single damning verse of scripture, Exodus 21:16. The verse, which Jonas had taught her, reads, "He who kidnaps a man and sells him shall surely be put to death." This was not just a quote, it was a verdict, a curse, and a final judgment passed upon her father. This hidden source, assembled in secret, was a masterpiece of archival resistance. It contained visual evidence, the portrait, material evidence, the ring, written testimony, the diary, and a theological indictment, the embroidered verse. Each object was carefully chosen to tell a part of the story, to corroborate the other pieces and create a cohesive and undeniable narrative. Evelyn was not just a victim of history. In her final hours of lucidity, she became its secret archivist, its first and most important historian. The decision to place these items in a heavy iron lockbox and hide it beneath the floorboards of the church was a final, brilliant, strategic move. She was burying her evidence in the very heart of the institution that had committed the crime, placing a time bomb of truth at the scene of the desecration. She must have known that the church itself would likely stand for generations, a silent guardian of the secret it contained. It was an act of incredible foresight, a belief that one day, somehow, the box would be found and its contents understood. The discovery of this hidden source in 1957 was therefore not just the unearthing of a tragic story, but the fulfillment of Evelyn's final plan. She had successfully created a primary source document that survived for over a century, a message in a bottle that finally reached its intended shore. The lockbox was her ultimate victory over her father. He had the power to kill a man and silence a town, but she had found a way to make the truth immortal, to ensure that the final word on their story would be hers. This act of creating a hidden source transforms our understanding of Evelyn. She was not simply a romantic heroine who died for love. She was a meticulous, intelligent, and courageous archivist of her own life who understood the power of evidence and the long, slow arc of historical justice. In the darkest moment of her life, she did not surrender to despair, but instead forged a weapon out of memory itself, a weapon that would ultimately succeed in destroying the wall of silence her father had built. The final legible entry in Evelyn Dorsey's diary, dated November 1st, 1846, is a document of chilling and resolute clarity. It is not the scattered, grief-stricken writing of the previous days. Instead, it is a focused, methodical, and deeply theological justification for the decisive action she was about to take. This passage reveals that her plan to set fire to the church was not an impulsive act of destructive rage, but a calculated, symbolic, and, in her mind, righteous act of spiritual cleansing. It was a final sermon, delivered not in words, but in flame. The entry begins with a stark description of the scene she anticipates for that morning's Sunday service. This morning, Father will stand upon the altar where Jonas's blood has not yet been fully scrubbed and speak of God's mercy, she wrote. This single sentence encapsulates the unbearable blasphemy of the situation. Her father, a murderer, was preparing to perform the sacred rites of communion in a space that had been desecrated by an act of profound evil. The altar, a symbol of Christ's sacrifice and grace, had been turned into a stage for a hypocrite. From this premise, her justification flows with an inexorable logic. He has turned this sanctuary into a tomb, its altar into a whipping post, she continued. There is only one scripture left for such a place, the cleansing by fire. In her interpretation of Christian theology, a temple so profoundly profaned could not be redeemed through prayer or ritual. It had to be purged. Her planned act of arson was, in her own mind, a fulfillment of biblical precedent, a necessary and holy act of destruction to purify a space that had been given over to evil. The diary entry then details her preparations, each one laden with symbolic weight. "I will wear white," she declared, "the color of brides and of shrouds." This choice of attire was a powerful and deliberate statement. In a single garment, she was invoking her sacred, unrecognized marriage to Jonas, while also acknowledging that this act would be her own death sentence. She was simultaneously a widow demanding justice and a martyr preparing for her own sacrifice. She was embracing both her love and her fate, weaving them together in the very fabric of her clothing. Her decision to confront her father publicly, to interrupt his sermon before the entire congregation, was a crucial part of her plan. She knew this would be her only opportunity to speak her truth to the community that had silenced her. Her final diary entry outlines the testimony she intended to deliver, a direct and damning accusation that would leave no room for misinterpretation. She would not let her father hide behind the language of Scripture. She would confront his lies with the raw, undeniable truth of his actions. The source justifies her actions not as a means of escape or revenge, but as an act of ultimate spiritual necessity. She saw it as her duty to prevent her father from committing a further act of blasphemy by speaking another lie from the desecrated altar. Her goal was not to harm the congregation, but to shatter their complicit silence, to force them to bear witness to the truth they had allowed to be buried. The fire was not an attack on the church as a building, but on the false and corrupt version of faith it had come to represent. This justification, laid out so clearly in her own words, is crucial to understanding the historical event. It refutes the official narrative of delirium and religious mania that would later be used to dismiss her actions. She was not mad. She was operating within a coherent and deeply felt theological framework. Her actions were radical, but they were not irrational. They were the logical conclusion of her intellectual and spiritual journey, the final desperate act of a woman who believed she was serving a higher and truer form of justice. The suspense in this final entry is built not through a description of the act itself, but through the cold, methodical detailing of her preparations. The calm and certainty with which she outlines her plan is more chilling than any description of a frenzied, emotional outburst could be. It is the calm of a person who has accepted their fate, who has weighed the consequences and found them to be a necessary price for the defense of truth. She was not just a victim, she was a judge, and she was about to pass sentence. Ultimately, her decision for decisive action was a reclamation of her own agency. Robbed of her love, her freedom, and her voice, she found one final, powerful way to make herself heard. The fire she was about to set was a signal, a beacon of truth in a community that had been plunged into moral darkness. It was a declaration that even if her body could be imprisoned and her story erased, her spirit and the truth it carried would not be extinguished. The last contemporary documents to speak of Evelyn Dorsey are as cold and impersonal as a tombstone. They represent the final, successful effort of the official narrative to overwrite her truth, to categorize her righteous fury as female hysteria and bury her story under the weight of institutional authority. A brief article in the Amherst Gazette, dated November 3, 1846, provides the public sanitized version of the events that transpired during that fateful Sunday service. It is a masterpiece of understatement and misdirection, designed to calm the nerves of the community and close the book on a disturbing chapter. Tragic fire at St. Matthew's, the headline reads. A fire broke out during Sunday service, causing significant damage to the chapel altar. The blaze was reportedly started by Miss Evelyn Dorsey, daughter of the Reverend, who interrupted the sermon in a state of delirium before collapsing. The language is carefully chosen. The fire is tragic, an unfortunate event. Evelyn is in a state of delirium, her actions devoid of reason or intent. She does not act, she collapses. The article reduces her calculated act of theological protest to a mere symptom of illness. This newspaper account is the first primary source to publicly codify the lie. It plants the seed of the narrative that would persist for over a century, that of the poor, troubled pastor's daughter, a victim of her own fragile mind. There is no mention of Jonas, no mention of a public execution, no mention of the months of secret meetings and the vow made in the crypt. The context is entirely stripped away, leaving only the image of a madwoman and a fire. This interpretation was not just a journalistic failure, it was a deliberate act of social control, a community closing ranks to protect one of its own. The final primary source document is even more chilling in its bureaucratic finality. It is a single-line entry in the admission ledger of the Sisters of Mercy Convent in Richmond, a facility that often served as a genteel asylum for women deemed problematic by their families. The entry reads, Evelyn Dorsey, admitted November 2, 1846. Diagnosis, melancholia and religious mania. This clinical diagnosis was her social and intellectual death sentence. It officially stripped her of her credibility, her agency and her sanity. Her voice was now medically certified as unreliable. The convent was not a place of healing, but of containment. It was where inconvenient women were sent to disappear, their stories fading into the quiet routines of the institution. Evelyn's life there was, by all accounts, brief and silent. The convent's records contain no further notes on her condition, no letters, no personal effects. She was a ghost within their walls, a body without a story. Her final chapter was one of enforced silence, a cruel and ironic end for a woman who had fought so hard to make her truth known. The last entry concerning her is in the same convent ledger, dated just a few months later. Deceased, February 14, 1847, buried in the convent's unmarked cemetery. The date of her death, Valentine's Day, is a final bitter twist of fate. She died alone, her love story unknown, her body interred without a name in a forgotten corner of the convent grounds. The official interpretation of her life was now complete. She had been diagnosed, contained, and erased. The system had won. When interpreted together, these final sources reveal the terrifying efficiency with which a society can manufacture its own history. The newspaper provided the public narrative, the convent provided the medical justification, and the unmarked grave provided the physical erasure. The truth of what happened in Amherst was not lost. It was actively and systematically destroyed. The story was concluded, the file was closed, and the community was allowed to forget. However, when viewed through the lens of the evidence found in the lockbox, these final documents become not an ending, but a cover-up. Evelyn's delirium becomes righteous anger. Her religious mania becomes a profound, if radical, theological conviction. Her death in the convent is not the sad fading of a troubled mind, but the tragic, final silencing of a crucial witness. The official sources, intended to be the final word, are transformed into the final pieces of evidence in the case against Reverend Dorsey and the community that enabled him. The interpretation of these sources is therefore entirely dependent on which narrative one chooses to believe. For a century, the world chose to believe the official story. But the discovery of the lockbox provided a new key, a new way of reading these final cold documents. It allows us to see them not as a conclusion, but as the final act of a desperate and successful conspiracy to bury a terrible and inconvenient truth. In the years and decades following the fire at St. Matthew's Hollow Church, the most significant consequence was the profound and deliberate silence that descended upon the town of Amherst. The events of 1846 were not forgotten in a gradual organic process of fading memory. They were actively suppressed, a collective and successful effort to erase a chapter of history that reflected poorly on the town's moral character. The legacy of Evelyn Dorsey and Jonas was, for over a century, a legacy of programmatic erasure, a testament to the power of a community to edit its own past. The immediate consequences for the main actors were starkly different. Reverend Nathaniel Dorsey, far from being ruined by the scandal, saw his authority consolidated. He presented himself as a tragic figure, a grieving father who had lost his only daughter to a terrible affliction of the mind. He oversaw the repairs to the church, his new, grander steeple eventually rising as a symbol of the town's resilience and piety. He remained the pastor of St. Matthew's until his death from natural causes in 1851 and was buried with full honors in the church cemetery, his headstone praising him as a devout and righteous servant of God. The official records of the Amherst diocese, when examined by historians in the 20th century, show a conspicuous gap for the autumn of 1846. There is no mention of the fire, no record of disciplinary action against any enslaved person, no report of the pastor's daughter being sent away. It is a clean, surgical removal of the events from the institutional memory. This absence is, in itself, a form of documentation. It is the negative space that proves a cover-up occurred, a silence so loud and deliberate that it can only be interpreted as an admission of guilt. The oral history of the town preserved a fractured and distorted version of the story. Older residents would sometimes speak of the Dorsey fire and the pastor's sad, mad daughter, but the context was completely lost. Jonas's name vanished entirely from the collective memory. The story became a piece of cautionary folklore, a vague tale about the dangers of female emotional instability and religious fervor. The love story, the murder, the act of protest, all the essential elements were stripped away, leaving only a hollow and misleading caricature. The most profound and lasting consequence, however, was the one fulfilled by Evelyn's own foresight. The discovery of the lockbox in 1957 was a seismic event for the small town of Amherst. It was the return of the repressed, the exhumation of a truth that had been buried alive. The artifacts provided undeniable physical proof that the official story was a lie. The diary, the ring, the portrait, and the embroidered verse systematically dismantled the sanitized version of history and replaced it with a raw, brutal, and deeply human narrative. This revelation forced a painful public reckoning. The local diocese, confronted with irrefutable evidence of a murder and cover-up orchestrated by one of its own, was compelled to act. In 1958, it issued a formal public apology for the events of 1846. The grounds of St. Matthew's Hollow Church were reconsecrated in a solemn ceremony, an acknowledgement that the space had been profaned and needed to be spiritually cleansed, just as Evelyn had believed over a century earlier. Her radical act was, in a sense, finally validated. The legacy of the story also rippled out into the academic world. The Dorsey case became a subject of study for historians specializing in the antebellum South, women's history, and the role of the church in the institution of slavery. It served as a powerful case study of how official records can be manipulated and how alternative hidden archives can survive to challenge them. Evelyn Dorsey, once dismissed as a madwoman, was posthumously recast as a figure of resistance, a proto-feminist and abolitionist who used the only weapons at her disposal to fight an unjust system. The physical legacy on the town itself is more subtle. The church was rebuilt and still stands today, but its history is now told with a new, more painful honesty. A small, discreet plaque was installed near the altar, briefly recounting the story of Evelyn and Jonas and acknowledging the tragic events of 1846. The unmarked grave where Jonas was buried has never been located, a permanent and sorrowful reminder of the finality of his erasure. His only monument is the portrait Evelyn drew, a copy of which now hangs in the local historical society. Ultimately, the documented consequences show a story that came full circle. An act of violent erasure was eventually met with an act of historical recovery. A century of lies was undone by a single, rusted iron box. The legacy of Evelyn and Jonas is therefore a dual one. It is a testament to the brutal efficiency of institutional power, but it is also a profound and enduring testament to the resilience of truth and the belief that a story, if carefully preserved, can wait as long as it needs to for the world to be ready to hear it. The story of Evelyn Dorsey and Jonas is a powerful and unsettling confluence of documented history and enduring mystery. It operates on two distinct levels, each supported by its own set of primary sources. The first is the official narrative, constructed from newspaper articles, church ledgers, and institutional records. This story is one of order, piety, and a lamentable but contained tragedy involving mental illness. It is a narrative designed to reassure, to close the book, and to allow the community to move on without confronting its own complicity in a great evil. The second narrative is the one that emerged from the rusted lockbox in 1957. This is the counter-narrative, the story told through a scorched diary, a silver ring, a charcoal portrait, and a piece of embroidered scripture. This version speaks of forbidden love, intellectual awakening, systemic hypocrisy, murder, and a final, desperate act of righteous protest. It is a story designed not to reassure, but to disrupt, to challenge the very foundations of the official record and force a re-examination of the past. The central conflict of the Dorsey case is the irresolvable tension between these two histories. The historian's analysis must conclude that the evidence contained within the lockbox is too specific, too personal, and too cohesive to be dismissed. The physical artifacts corroborate the written testimony of the diary, creating a closed loop of evidence that is incredibly compelling. The embroidered verse from Exodus is not a random quotation. It is a direct and specific indictment of Reverend Dorsey's plan to sell Jonas. The ring is not just a piece of jewelry, it is the physical proof of a vow described in detail in the diary. The sources in the box support each other, creating a narrative of profound internal consistency. This forces us to reinterpret the official records not as objective accounts of events, but as primary sources documenting a cover-up. The Reverend's clinical description of Jonas's death becomes a murderer's sanitized confession. The newspaper's diagnosis of delirium becomes a piece of propaganda designed to discredit a witness. The convent's ledger becomes the final tool of a conspiracy to silence and erase. The official history, once seen as the truth, is revealed to be the final layer of the crime itself. Yet an open question remains, one that transcends the specifics of this single case. How many other stories like this one remain buried beneath the floorboards of our history? The Dorsey case is exceptional only in that its hidden archive was discovered. For every Evelyn Dorsey who had the foresight and the means to create a lockbox of evidence, how many thousands of others were silenced completely, their stories lost to time, their names and experiences vanishing without a trace? The unmarked grave of Jonas is a symbol of this greater, unrecoverable loss. This question extends to the legacy of the town itself. Amherst today is a place that has, on the surface, confronted its past. The plaque is on the wall, the apology has been issued, but local folklore persists in a way that suggests the story is not entirely settled. Residents still speak of the legend of the second bell chime, the faint, ethereal echo that follows the main toll of the 6 o'clock bell at St. Matthew's. They call it Evelyn's ring, a quiet, persistent sound that cannot be explained by acoustics or mechanics. This piece of folklore, while easily dismissed, can be interpreted as a metaphor for historical memory itself. It suggests that even when a story is officially acknowledged and archived, its emotional and spiritual resonance can linger in a place, an echo of unresolved justice that continues to sound long after the main events have concluded. It is the community's subconscious refusal to let the story become a closed chapter, a recognition that the moral questions it raises are still relevant. The ultimate analysis of the Dorsey case is that it is a profound lesson in the nature of historical truth. It reminds us that history is not a fixed and settled narrative, but a contested space, a battleground between official records and buried memories. The story of Evelyn and Jonas endured not because it was powerful, but because it was preserved. Their love, condemned as a sin and punished as a crime, survived as testimony only because of a young woman's courageous and desperate act of becoming her own archivist. The open question left for all of us is to wonder what other truths are still out there, waiting patiently in the dark for the sound of a shovel striking iron. The stories we bury define us more than the ones we celebrate. They are the true measure of our conscience, the ghosts that whisper the lessons we are most afraid to learn. If you believe that confronting these dark chapters is not just a matter of historical curiosity, but a moral necessity, then join us at Before the Story. Subscribe and become part of a community dedicated to unearthing the truths that refuse to stay silent, because it is only by listening to the echoes of the past that we can hope to understand our present.